I wanted to use the time that we have together here to talk a little about what the Air Force is doing in national security space and some of the results that we're seeing. And I kind of reflect back on the time that seems like a long time ago now, when I was preparing for my confirmation as Secretary of the Air Force. And when I was drafting my confirmation testimony, I actually couldn't say space and warfighting in the same sentence. At least I was told that by someone who was something of a holdover from the previous administration in the civil service, and I told the person that they would have to get someone more senior to tell me that I couldn't say that. Since then, there is a broad understanding that space is a warfighting domain just like land and sea and air. The President has reestablished the National Space Council, and we have a national space strategy that provides a framework and gives us guidance to protect our vital national interests in space. The President's fiscal year 19 budget that we are now implementing, his 5-year budget increased and accelerated defendable space with $7 billion in additional funding to the base budget and reprogramming of another $5 billion to accelerate defendable space. America is the best in the world at space, and our adversaries know it. And they are seeking to develop the capability to deny us the use of space in crisis or war. So the Air Force is accelerating defendable space, focusing on really 3 things: developing the strategies and concepts of operation and the programs to implement those strategies for a contested domain. Second, implementing acquisition reform. And third, building strong partnerships. Now, while this audience understands, I actually find most people don't really know what we do in space and why it really matters to our economy and to our military. The Air Force operates 77 satellites in space, and the Navy has another 13 for some special communications needs. The National Reconnaissance Office is our joint special program with the CIA that has grown into a standalone entity, but it is still about 40% Air Force people, and the NRO specializes in the intelligence collection in space, mostly pictures, but also other things. So the intelligence part we do jointly with the CIA and something called the NRO, but our other missions are also important. The Air Force does missile warning. We detect the intense heat of rocket launches, and we rapidly calculate where they're heading to tell the National Command Authority what's happening and what we must do next. 33 of our 77 satellites that the Air Force operates are GPS, that wonderful invention that gives you that blue dot on your phone. It's operated by a squadron of about 40 young airmen in Schriever Air Force Base outside Colorado Springs, Colorado. Average age 22, which scares me every time I say that. That not only gives you the blue dot on your phone, it gives the timing signal for the New York Stock Exchange and for every automated teller machine in America. We also communicate in space, ensuring that the President can give orders reliably to his commanders in the field around the globe, no matter what, with absolute reliability. We watch the weather from space. We monitor treaty compliance, including detection of nuclear tests. And the Air Force operates the launch facilities for America to get to space, civil and military. The declining cost of launch and the shrinking size of payloads has made space accessible to more countries and companies. Space is rapidly becoming a common domain for human endeavor. So we built these missions and the capabilities to carry out these missions at a time where space was not a contested environment, and we operated them like your most reliable utility company for 60 years. And our adversaries watched us. They watched how we relied on space for every military mission from the Gulf War on. In 2007, China demonstrated the ability to launch a missile from the ground and destroy one of their own dead weather satellites. And the irony is that we have been warning the Chinese about the potential impact of the debris that they created on their own satellites since that day. There's something weird about that. We must now not only provide these vital capabilities from space, but we have to be able to do so when under attack. The strategies to prevail in space, as we do in the air and on the ground and at sea, began to be developed under my predecessor and have been given renewed momentum and focus by both increased funding and an emphasis on the shift to warfighting in space. Over the last 18 months, particularly leading up to the fiscal year 19 budget proposal and submission, the Air Force did extensive wargaming and simulation to inform our program choices that were included in the President's budget and that now Congress has approved. I'm not going to go into detail here, but I will say that the analytical work that informed our strategic and programmatic choices was some of the best that I have seen in my time as Secretary of the Air Force. And that research and analysis was done primarily by Air Force Space Command. We turned our analysis into a war game to illustrate options and choices for senior leaders in the Pentagon and on Capitol Hill. In our fiscal year 19 budget, there were two big changes that the Chief of Staff and I testified about, two things that we asked the Congress to engage with us on and consider. The first was advanced battle management and canceling a program called JSTARS and going in a different direction. And the second was accelerating defendable space, including the cancellation of a couple of large projects. Last year, as we stewarded our budget through the Congress, we conducted almost 25 tabletop exercises, including with the key leaders in Congress in classified session. And to me, the interesting story in that presentation of last year's Air Force budget is the dog that didn't bark. Our program for accelerating defendable space wasn't really controversial because we got so many people to engage with us in a complicated tabletop exercise to show them where we would reprogram $5 billion and add another $7 billion to accelerate defendable space. And the Congress supported it without a lot of public debate or criticism or discussion. We continue to develop and pressure test those strategies so that we use every dollar that we are given well, and we continue to dominate in space. Last week, the Chief of Staff and I directed another 90-day review with red teams and the best intelligence that we have to inform our fiscal year 21 budget submission and validate the strategies and the programs that we have in order to continue to dominate in space. So strategies, concepts of operation tied to programs in our 5-year budget is one of the big things the Air Force is focused on. Secondly, we have focused on implementing acquisition reform. Now, when I was in Congress, like everyone else, I advocated for acquisition reform. It's a whole lot easier to advocate for it than to implement it. I would even go so far as to say that we are implementing it in the Air Force more aggressively and systematically than in any other entity in government. Space is a good example, but it is only an example of what the Air Force is doing. And I have some wonderful help with a great team. Will Roper and Darlene Costello and J.T. Thompson and people like Colonel Bon Jovi and his team are a great team of professionals that are all A players when it comes to excellence in acquisition. In April, we began restructuring the Space and Missile Systems Center to be more muscular and more agile. We flattened the organization by removing 3 layers of bureaucracy, and we empowered program executive officers with full decision authority on their programs, taking advantage of the congressional change that pushed more acquisition authority back to the services so that we could make faster and smarter decisions. I kept none of that authority at my level. There is not a program manager in the Air Force that needs to come and brief me before a decision is made. And that's because I know I don't add any value to their decision. But what I can add is time and complexity in a bureaucracy. And it's my job to strip that away so that Colonel Bon Jovi and his team can get after it and do the work. We created 3 new program executives in space, which before was our largest program executive officer. And rather than keep that concentrated over a $7 billion portfolio, we now have 3 PEOs for space. PEO for Space Development, Program Executive Office for Space Production, and the Program Executive Office for Space Enterprise. The changes were intended to accelerate the speed of decisions and improve program execution, to buy things faster and smarter. The Space and Missile Systems Center identified 9 pace-setter programs to prove out the concepts of this reorganization. It's not enough to just reorganize and redo the org chart. We have to identify programs that are supposed to prove out why those changes would make a difference. The central reorganization reached initial operating capability last month, but it has been notching up achievements all year. In January, we established the Space Enterprise Consortium to minimize the barriers to entry for small businesses and non-traditional vendors to be able to supply military space. It started with $100 million, and we've increased it since then, because the consortium has grown to 223 companies in just 11 months. 78% of them are small and non-traditional defense contractors. Using the rapid prototyping and fielding authorities that were given to us by Congress in November of 2017, this year the Space and Missile Systems Center alone has contracted for 34 prototypes in 6 different projects, approximately $110 million in value to members of the consortium. And we just reached the 1-year anniversary of getting those authorities from Congress, which is why I say the Air Force is leaning forward in implementing acquisition reform probably more than any other entity in government. The average time for awarded prototypes from a request for proposal to actually signing a contract is 90 days in that consortium, twice as fast, more than twice as fast as traditional contracting. You'll notice 2 characteristics here in these programs: speed and competition, both of which will help us to drive innovation. In the 9 pace-setter programs that we're using to validate our new approach to acquisition, we've stripped 19 years out of acquisition time from their schedules. 19 years stripped out of 9 pace-setter programs. In September, we used new authorities on 4 contracts for protected tactical satellite communications to get secure communications to 2 Navy carrier strike groups where we were facing a potential 2-year gap in coverage. And we used those authorities, and actually we're delivering a capability to them 18 months early. We canceled the 7th and 8th missile warning satellites and turned toward more survivable alternatives. We're using the authorities that Congress has given us to prototype in order to reduce acquisition time for those replacements, for those new generation of missile warning satellites, and we're saving 3.5 years in time by doing so. We started 2 satellites in August and 2 payload contracts in September. Again, prototyping to go fast and reduce risk, using competition to drive innovation and give us options. But it's not just satellite communications where we're doing this. The GPS 3F contract for jam-resistant GPS was awarded September 26th. That contract will develop the first 2 next-generation jam-resistant GPS satellites, and they'll provide an option to buy up to 20 additional jam-resistant GPS satellites. That's a $7.2 billion contract. It was awarded 6 months early and saved $1.6 billion compared to the independent cost estimate. The first GPS-3 satellite will launch on a Falcon 9 on December 18th from our launch facilities in Florida, and I'm trying to work my schedule to get there. While space isn't the only area where we are aggressively implementing acquisition improvements, it is a significant one, as it must be, to meet the emerging threats that our nation faces. But it's not just acquisition reform and changes to our strategies and concepts of operations that will help to meet the challenges of the 21st century. We are building partnerships. Nations with allies thrive, and those without allies do not, as Secretary Mattis likes to say. The National Space Strategy calls for stronger international partnerships to deter potential adversaries, to promote burden sharing, and to marshal cooperative responses to any threat. In October, we held the Schriever War Games at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. We've been doing it for several years. The U.S. was joined this year by participants from the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Germany, France, and for the first time, Japan. The war game looked at a variety of space conflict scenarios 10 years from now. Our partnership with Japan continues to grow, and they are going to be hosting a U.S. space situational awareness payload on 2 of Japan's version of their global positioning satellites, and that is progressing well. That first payload will be delivered in November of 2021, and the second payload will be delivered in April of 2022. And we've partnered with Norway to extend protected tactical satellite communications to the polar region by putting 2 U.S. payloads on Norwegian satellites. That will save the United States about $900 million and avoids a 2-year gap in polar communications coverage. Last year, we opened the aperture for our international partners to attend more basic and advanced Air Force space training courses. At the same time, we increased the length of undergraduate space training and increased the security classification level so we could hold candid discussions on the threats that we face. We will work with like-minded nations, with our allies, to strengthen operations, enhance deterrence, defend our vital national interests, and prevailed when called upon to do so. While we think of alliances and partnerships with other countries, one happened recently closer to home that I haven't seen talked about publicly heretofore. The United States Air Force recently got a call from CAL FIRE, the California firefighting entity. It was taking 12 to 18 hours for California airplanes to analyze data for firefighting officials during those horrific wildfires. In less than 10 hours from that phone call to the Space and Missile Systems Center, less than 10 hours from when they got the call to help, we contracted and got some partners in order to get data streaming to firefighters. Our industry partners staffed a center 24/7, and the Air Force Space and Missile Systems Center fused the data hourly, 10 times faster than existing means, to save lives in California. That's what airmen do. While Air Force Space is developing strategies, fielding space forces faster and smarter, and strengthening our alliances and attracting new partners, we have a lot more work to do. We look forward to 2020 and beyond. We will continue to analyze alternative strategies, explore new concepts, partner with new and emerging industries, and keep America the best in the world at space. Thank you all.